This is probably the dumbest idea I've ever had. So, for the longest time, I've always pondered the question of how a playthrough of Final Fantasy XIV would play if you were to actively limit yourself in a multitude of ways. Now, the idea I always come crawling back to is, what if I put permadeath into the game, where once my character dies, it's game over for good? Well, that sounds like a crazy idea at first, doesn't it? Well, you'd be right. Especially since Final Fantasy XIV is an MMO, meaning that cooperation with others is a core aspect of the game, and I would have no control over who I get paired up with. Thankfully, Final Fantasy XIV's main story is quite easy enough to blaze through, so while the party members I'd have across the run might be the only real cause for worry, the rest of the game should generally be smooth sailing. Well, that's where the extra restrictions come into play. Because just playing the game normally but you can't die isn't actually all that different from a regular playthrough, I then looked for more ways to cause myself harm throughout the game to make this experience more interesting. Now, I decided on 3 major rules to start the run out with alongside the permadeath. No trading with vendors, which would be any merchant NPC in the big cities or towns, no market board access allowed, and I must only play with random people in the duty finder, so no friends lists, FC, link shells, or communities. I plan to add more restrictions as the run progressed, but this rule set shown on screen now should suffice for at least the first 20 to 30 levels of the game. Also, if you were wondering, for the time being, I will be basing off whether or not I have died if I have gotten the active help for KO. Now, creating a character for this challenge and deciding on what class to start out with was the easy part. What wasn't quite as easy was giving our Rogaden here a name. Now, I had no intention of giving him a mesh of letters put together like those of the Seawolf clan normally do, but the Hellsguard's nomenclature wasn't very appealing either. After a bit of thought, I decided to borrow an idea from a friend of mine, who had the perfect solution to my predicament, and thus, I settled on the name. Our journey begins as you would expect, with a pleasant dream of committing battery against a cloaked individual in the vacuums of space. Where then the name awakes on a chocobo carriage ride out in the middle of the desert. An old merchant by the name of Brent asks to converse with us while we ride to Ul'dah, Jewel of the Desert. But unfortunately for Brent, the name does not speak. Before our friendly merchant can spout much exposition, however, the carriage is halted by a group of brass blades, a small army of mercenaries who find work in Ul'dah. They attempt to plant some items on our caravan, but are quickly attacked by a band of Amalja, allowing us to make a quick escape towards Ul'dah. Once our destination had been reached, we parted ways with Brent, who wished for us to become an adventurer that he could boast about having met before, leaving the name to enter the city on his own. Upon entering Ul'dah, we are pulled aside by a man named Wymond, who recognizes the name as not being a local and points us in the direction of the Quicksands, which houses the Adventurers Guild. Here we find Momodi, the proprietress of the Quicksands. She formally introduces us to Ul'dah and helps register the name as an official adventurer. As a bit of advice, Momodi directs us to go and complete a few tasks to get a better understanding of our new surroundings. So we quickly set off to attune to the nearest Aetheryte, introduce ourselves to the Pugilist Guild, and inquire about the main merchant hub of the city, despite the fact that I have no intention of bartering with them. But I do take this time to grab a few Aethernets around the map to help make travel much easier down the line. After that is done, I pivot back over to the Pugilist Guild and take on their first quest, which has us leaving the city to go hunt down some non-aggressive creatures in central Thanalan and give them the old right hook. Reporting back to Hamon, the Pugilist Guildmaster, he gives us some steak and a hunting log for our trouble, and then sends us on our way. Afterwards, I went back to Momodi, who wished for us to go and help a man named Papashan, who had recently requested aid from the Adventurers Guild. The name accepted the offer, but instead of heading straight there, I decided to take on a few side gigs to help get some better gear. If I'm not allowing myself to use vendors or the market board to obtain gear, I'll need to be resourceful and help out the locals to get what I need. So a quick trip out into Western Thanalan to complete a delivery nets the name a new shirt, and a bit of hunting log completion gets us some extra EXP. With that out of the way, we rendezvous with Papashan, who wants us to deliver some pretzels to a few guards on duty. While this isn't exciting work, there is a new weapon in it for me, so it didn't take much convincing. Next, Papashan requested that the name be on the lookout for a very important Ul'dah noble named Lilira, as she has appeared to have wandered off somewhere in central Thanalan. Thankfully, it didn't take much effort to locate her at all thanks to the almighty quest marker. Now, we weren't the only ones to find Lilira, as a stranger who seems acquainted with her appears to offer his aid in escorting her back to Papashan. before the three of us are attacked by a winged beast. With the help of our new comrade keeping the creature busy, we could deal with any other incoming threats without any real worry of taking too much damage. After slaying the beast, the name decides to pick up a shiny rock he found on the ground, which causes him to hallucinate. Visions of a talking crystal, wishing for the name to aid in banishing the darkness, are wild enough to jolt him awake just in time for Thancred, our kind stranger, to thrust the responsibility of getting Lilira to safety onto us. We complete our task and earn Papashan's eternal gratitude. Our next job has us delivering a pumpkin to Roger over in Blackbrush, where I also take the opportunity to attune to the Aetherite nearby and take a quick trip back over to Ul'dah to meet with Hamon again. The old geezer sends me out to pick up some change he left all over the city, then go kill some rocks to improve my punching skills. Once I finished that up, I journeyed back towards Blackbrush and got my next major assignment. I met with Wystan, who wants me to help oversee a new mining operation by some old ruins. I graciously accept his offer, but not without thinning out the local Spriggan population for my hunting logs first. When we arrived at the mining location, Wystan was found being attacked by a group of brass blades that are under the employ of Lord Lolorito, one of the members of the Ul'dah Syndicate. In order to stop Wystan from taking any potential profits from the already wealthy and powerful, the brass blades have been hired to do away with him. But before Wystan was put to the sword, a cloaked figure hiding in the shadows conjures up a golem, which scares away the blades, leaving the name to deal with it himself. The golem falls easy enough thanks to my previous rock punching practice, and Thancred arrives to give aid to an injured Wystan. Now before we could get our bearings and return to Blackbrush to plan our next move, the name suddenly faints and begins seeing another vision. But this time it is of Thancred, who is shown to be busy wooing the women of Ul'dah and overhearing talk about crystal looting and raids happening all across Thanalan. When the name awakes, Thancred instructs both us and Wystan to return to Blackbrush for the moment and keep our heads low as to not provoke the Syndicate to come after us again so soon. So we part ways with Wystan at Blackbrush and decide to head back to Ul'dah to pick up another class quest. Hamon sends me out into the streets of Ul'dah to punch some wood dummies, but before I continued any further with the quest, a visit to Momody was in order to figure out if we were in any danger with the Syndicate. She said we had absolutely nothing to worry about. And with that good news, I went and slaughtered a few Kirkin for Hamon, and paid a quick trip to Horizon to seek some work. Our primary mission was to aid some miners over near the Copperbell mines by dealing with some goblins, but I also took the time to clear out some monsters for the hunting log, since there were quite a few left to go. Afterwards, I went back to report to Hamon, and thanks to the name's excellent skills of persuasion, we were able to unlock the armory chest, meaning we could also begin unlocking new classes. The next set of quests we tackled had us raiding a local outlaw camp and slaying anyone who put up a resistance, while also grabbing some raw materials while I was at it. Afterwards, I fled the scene as quickly as possible to avoid any potential reinforcements giving chase. This gig was quite profitable, and the name even got a nice hat out of the ordeal. But it was once again time to visit the old man, who had us go and kill some toads for their legs. Then we watched as he fails to land a single hit on a low-level marmot. Thankfully, watching his complete embarrassment granted the name a new skill. And after leaving Hamon to wallow in his own despair, we traveled back to Western Thanalan to help investigate rumors of a brass-blade captain accepting bribes from outlaws around Horizon. This, unsurprisingly, turns out to be true, so we quickly put him down and return to Momody, who finally has a big job for us to tackle. He informs us that the Sultana's crown has been recently stolen, and we are to help the Sultansworn, guardians of the royal line, locate it before this news hits the public, which would cause a serious uproar in the political world of Ul'dah if it did. So we meet with Owen, the man who was on guard duty the night the crown was stolen, and we hatch a plan to meet with the thieves to pay the ransom they desire in exchange for the crown back. But as you would expect, this deal doesn't exactly go as planned, and we're forced to call on some backup to aid us in dealing with the thieves directly. A large battle breaks out between the two forces, with the name caught in the middle, but just by focusing our efforts on the boss, the thieves quickly fall apart and begin fleeing. Owen, Papashan, and the rest of the Sultansworn give chase to retrieve the crown, but the name is caught unawares by another cloaked figure. They conjure a gargoyle and begin attacking us. Now while I believe a 2 versus 1 are some decent odds, given how strong we've become in such a short time, Thancred does arrive fashionably late to help us take down the opposition, and with our combined might, we completely wipe the floor with the masked mage and his pet. Afterwards, Thancred bids us a quick farewell as he has some investigating to do on the masked men, named the Asians, and we decide to return to Ul'dah to report to the Sultansworn. So it is quite surprising that upon our arrival, the Sultana herself personally greets the Name to give her thanks for helping to retrieve her cherished heirloom. As a gift, the Name is invited to a banquet that is held by the High Society of Ul'dah. This will be the best time to try and get in with the nobles of the city and immerse myself in Ul'dah culture. First things first though, we run back to Momodi to get some advice on how to present ourselves well for the nobles, so we touch up our fashion sense and put on some special earrings that will get us access to the party. The banquet goes about how you would expect it to, with the Name spending most of his time either attempting to converse with Papashan, despite the Name's unwillingness to speak, or listening to Raubon, General of the Immortal Flames, introduce the Sultana Nanamo Ulnamo to the banquet to officially recognize the Name's efforts. Eventually, Raubon pulls us aside to confide his feelings about the problems plaguing Ul'dah, mainly the rampant poverty and corruption of the Syndicate. Unfortunately, there's not much either of us can do about that at this moment, so the topic of conversation shifts to the recent calamity that has struck Eorzea and the heroes who fought against it, the Warriors of Light. Now, whether it was hearing that title or just out of plain boredom, the Name begins to faint in the middle of the banquet and begins to see another vision. This time of a great battle 5 years prior, where the combined forces of Eorzea fought against the Garlean Empire on the fields of Carteneau, where a great calamity struck the land.
Mad Snake! Mad Snake!
We awake to find ourselves in an inn at the Quicksands, where Momodi lets us know that Raubon wants to meet up again to give us an assignment. The Name isn't someone to keep another waiting without a good reason, so we quickly make haste to the General, who wants us to act as an envoy to the neighboring nations of Ul'dah to suggest holding a memorial for the Warriors of Light and the lives lost at Carteneau. With the promise of travel to other lands, it didn't take much for us to graciously accept this offer, and quickly board an airship to our first destination, Limsa Lominsa. We get a foreboding transition over to see what the Garlean Empire has been cooking for the past 5 years after the calamity, and see that their aim is to begin another campaign to conquer Eorzea. Unfortunately, there isn't much we can do about that now, and after a decently long airship ride, the Name arrived in Limsa Lominsa. Now, Limsa is a port city known for its sailors and pirates, but also for its innumerable amount of AFK players and bots. But we quickly brush past all of them and attune to a few Aethernets before heading to our destination to get our business done as quickly as possible. The meeting with Merle Webb, the Admiral of Limsa Lominsa, goes swimmingly, as she is quite keen to the idea of holding a memorial for the fallen. She signs off on an agreement and sends the Name on his way to Gridania. But before we depart once again, I take this time to do some sightseeing and complete a few objectives. First, I made a beeline to the Culinarians Guild, and enlisted to be able to legally cook my own food whenever I wanted. We can't do much with Culinarian just yet, since we lack any raw materials to make food, so to rectify this, our next location is the Fishers Guild. I grab the first rod I see and quickly depart to engross myself in the greatest battle between man and beast. But it was then that I quickly realized that fishing relies on consumable bait that is normally obtained by purchasing it at vendors or completing quests. Now, there are ways for me to craft bait later down the road, so for the time being, I decide to hold off on fishing until I can make the bait myself. Lastly, I travel outside of Limsa to grab some nearby Aetherites that will make travel much easier later on, but then I quickly ride back to the city gates and catch the next flight over to Gridania. Now, similar to Limsa, our first objective here in Gridania is to speak to the Elder Seedseer about the memorial, in which she seems to be very receptive to Raubon's suggestion as well. She too signs an agreement to hold a memorial here in Gridania and concludes our meeting, giving us free reign to explore the city. Gridania is surrounded by nature all around, having some of the prettiest sights to see in all of Eorzea. So it seemed obvious that my first stop here in the city is to join the Botanists Guild so I can claim a bountiful harvest from the land. The Name terrorizes the local flora and fauna until I had enough raw materials to use Culinarian to craft some maple syrup and sugar, leveling up both jobs in the process. Next, I made a brief visit to Uldah's Miners Guild to learn the ways of the pickaxe. I hit some rocks for a few minutes to boost the job's level to 6, and then I began my journey back to Limsa for my next major quest. After returning to Limsa Lominsa, the Name is approached with a job to help investigate a potential pirate problem over by Aleport in western Lenosha, as the Lominsan forces there already have their hands full with the neighboring beast tribe threats. We accept the mission and quickly take a boat over to Aleport and pay a visit to the Hall of the Novice, where we can learn the basics of tackling content with others and obtain rewards for doing so. We learn valuable lessons here, such as dodging AoEs, punching really hard, stealing aggro from our fellow party members, and the art of intimidation. This all culminates in a final test where we defeat a helpless Gubu and obtain a nice ring that grants us a 30% EXP boost for the first 30 levels. With that done and dusted, I make my way over to where these pirates are rumored to be camping out in Sastasha. There are various adventurers gathered around the cave's entrance who have been recruited to investigate the same rumors the name has, but none of them seem to be fully put together. I talk with the yellow jacket guarding the entrance and unlock the first dungeon of the game. Now, as a reminder, according to the rules of this challenge, I must take on every duty with a group of random people to maximize my chances of something going wrong, so no utilizing the recently added duty support system for me. So with nothing else to do, I queue into Sastasha, hoping that I would have a somewhat decent party. Sastasha in general is a pretty straightforward dungeon, where you navigate a few narrow hallways and deal with enemies along the way to a boss. Rinse and repeat the process a few times and you're done. So I went into this expecting a pretty standard experience, but instead I was paired with some fellow new players, which didn't surprise me either. Unfortunately, for one reason or another, our tank refused to apply their tank stance for the entire duration of the dungeon despite being asked to multiple times, meaning the other DPS and I needed to moderate how much damage we were doing as to not rip aggro and die instantly. This is a good time to ask myself why the hell I decided to pick Pugilist as my class. Anyways, outside of the imminent fear of death if I landed a critical hit on any of the ads, the rest of the dungeon was pretty smooth, with our party even stopping to explore some of the tucked away segments of the Sastasha caves to rescue some kidnapped citizens and slay some nasty pirates, which is something I rarely see new parties do anymore. Eventually, we tracked down the pirate leader into the deepest parts of the caves, where we then faced the Sahagin Den the Orcatooth, a member of the beast tribe that the Lamensons are currently warring with. Because of our tank's limited aggro management keeping me from focusing purely on the boss, I instead pivot to playing support by locking out reinforcements from entering the battlefield, which would have probably overwhelmed our team. After a brief yet somewhat stressful encounter, Den falls to our merry band and we part ways after exiting Sastasha, leaving the name to report his findings. It isn't long after this that we get a request from the Wood Whalers of Gridania to aid in taking down a cult that is held up in the Tamtara Deepcroft, an old crypt where the denizens of the Black Shroud would go to put their dead to rest. So we depart for the Central Shroud, attuned to the Bent Branch Meadows Aetheryte, and arrive at the entrance to the Deepcroft, where we hear that some of the adventurers that were exploring Sastasha were unable to make much progress into the Deepcroft without being run off by cultists. Nevertheless, we unlocked the dungeon anyways, and while I waited for a party to be formed, I decided to go back to Ul'dah to visit the old man again and see what was next for me to learn. His student had us venture to Eastern Thanalin and slay some hornets. However, I was only able to attune to the nearest Aetheryte before a party for the Tamtara Deepcroft had been created and the dungeon began. Now, Tamtara is similar to Sastasha in terms of structure, as are most dungeons in Final Fantasy XIV, so there really wouldn't be anything to worry about when it came to any potential enemy surprises. But what did worry me is that I had been partied up with another tank that didn't utilize their aggro stance to keep enemies off the rest of the team. However, this time around, our sage took the time early into the dungeon to walk the tank through their aggro management process, including tank stance, and from that point onward, the dungeon went really well. Kudos to that healer for helping out. You're one of the few decent mentors out there. The cultists hanging out in the Deepcroft stood no chance against our party, and any Void Saint creatures they summoned quickly fell to our might. Afterwards, our party bid farewell to each other, and the name journeyed back to Gridania to give the Wood Whalers the good news after finishing up in Eastern Thanalin. While regaling our tale of daring do, we overheard another group of adventurers who weren't as lucky with their foray into the Deepcroft, where the tank lost their life due to overconfidence and an inexperienced healer, who now carries around the dismembered head of her fallen comrade. It reminded me that even though we've had a pretty easy time so far in this challenge run, death could be waiting around any corner, and I need to watch myself going forward as to not end up like them. But after concluding my business in Gridania, it was time to head back to Ul'dah as Hamon wanted to challenge the name to a duel to improve his combat capabilities. Next, Momodi put us in contact with the workers in the Copperbell mines, who seemed to be having some trouble with the beasts they found within the mines. Wasting no time, I ran a chocobo and make my way towards Copperbell mines, where some familiar faces await me. I unlock the dungeon and begin the queue, taking this time to deal with the rest of the enemies on my hunting log, including some toads, buzzards, a tortoise, and the local goblin population. But eventually a party is formed to go into the Copperbell mines, and hoo boy, let me tell you that this team cleaned out this place like pros. We had everything. Tank stance, quick movement, high damage, non-verbal coordination, and a good attitude. Nothing could stop us from completing our objective. It was a breath of fresh air, and I was sad to see this team disband so quickly, but we needed to go and report back to Momodi. With spirits high, the name arrives in the quicksands to share the good news when suddenly we hear a commotion outside. Emerging from our vision, the refugee thanks us for dealing with the vagabonds, and we're then approached by Thancred, who tells us that he's been watching our exploits since we originally left Ul'dah as envoy. He tells us that he knows we've been seeing these visions recently, and that if we want to get answers on what exactly they are, to let Momodi know, and she'd help from there. So, a quick stop to see Momodi again, and she tells us that Thancred belongs to a group known as the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, and they operate out of a building in Vesper Bay called the Waking Sands. With this information, the name departs to introduce himself to these Scions at Vesper Bay. The receptionist at the front of the building, Tataru, greets the name and confirms he's on the list of guests to be on the lookout for, so she lets us in to see the head of the organization. Minfilia, the leader of the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, and the other Scions are gracious hosts, answering any questions regarding the name's visions, which happens to be a byproduct of a power known as the Echo, which Minfilia also possesses. She invites the name to join their operation to safeguard Eorzea's future from any potential threat, such as the Primals, false gods manifested into being by worship that drain the land of its life. The name accepts this invitation without much issue. While we were introduced to all of the major members of the Scions here, the only one who is of any importance right now would be our old friend Thancred, who is currently investigating a potential primal threat in eastern Thanlin. In order to get us some work on the field, Minfilia suggests that we tag along with Thancred and see if we can help solve this problem. Now, as a bit of payback for being late to aid us in combat before, I decided to go and do some side quests before meeting up with Thancred, starting with going to southern Thanlin to complete another side quest for Hamon. I had to set up some training dummies all around the map, which actually required me to plan my movement and sneak around certain enemies, as most of them were a few levels higher than me, and if I were to be too careless, this could have easily spelled an end to the run. But after some time, I was able to place all of the dummies in their designated spots and got the hell out of there. I then traveled back to Lenosha to gather some materials and make some orange juice for a lady by the Waking Sands. This was needed to obtain the ability to glamour and dye my gear. If I'm going to be hunting down false gods, I had to update my attire to fit the part. So I made my way back to Camp Drybone in eastern Thanlin, where all of the commotion seemed to be, and talks to a man named Isambard. He points us towards a caravan that hasn't arrived in town yet, and upon investigation, we find that the caravan was attacked by a band of Amalja, the beastmen we saw just before stepping foot into Ul'dah. We were able to fend off the Amalja, but none of the merchants could be saved, so we sadly had to deliver their bodies back to Isambard. He takes the bodies to go be embalmed, and tells us to go and deliver a letter to Ungust about missing people. Ungust happens to be one of the men who were harassing the refugee earlier, and begrudgingly tells us to go and get some information out of any of the beggars near Camp Drybone, as they seem to be the current targets for the missing people's case. While no immediately useful information turned up, we were able to at least help with the burial process of those we found earlier, and I decided to use this time to ask around the nearby chapel and one of their members, Orson, but nothing of importance came up when asking her about the missing people's case. Without much of a lead to go on, Thancred then arrives extremely late, but insists on having us investigate Orson as he believes a member of the church is behind the recent missing person cases. Though upon tracing Orson's movements, we couldn't incriminate her with anything and instead even had to help her fend off some undead pikemen north of Camp Drybone. As a backup plan, Thancred then decides to send the name into a nearby Amalja outpost to see if he can find anything to help with this case. So I first tried to be diplomatic and approached the outpost calmly. Well, that didn't work, but I didn't leave empty-handed, as a letter detailing a scheme hatched between the Amalja and a certain merchant was found. The name celebrated this discovery with a little jig, before delivering the letter straight to Thancred, who set about creating a trap to catch our culprit. Orson, after recovering from her wounds earlier, suggests to Thancred that someone must be posing as a clergyman to lure beggars into isolation. So Thancred and the name dress up as beggars and trap who else but Ungust in the act of attempting to coerce us into following him. Ungust comes clean, but Thancred decides to bring him to the authorities in order to hatch a counterattack against the Amalja. In the meantime, I decide to go do a quick errand for Menphilia to learn about materia, and then I head back to Camp Drybone. A sergeant of the Immortal Flames requested that the name take part in an ambush, where the plan is to have Ungust lure out the Amalja he had been dealing with, then surrounding them on all sides. With this plan in motion, we make our way to the meeting spot and lay in wait for the Amalja to arrive to converse with Ungust. Surprisingly, they show up, so our forces moved in to surprise the Amalja, but something seemed off. All of a sudden, Amalja reinforcements arrived and had us surrounded. Ungust had ratted to the Beast Tribe about our plans, and a mole within the Immortal Flames had been giving away patrol schedules to the Amalja, giving them the opportune time to strike us. Surrounded on all sides, the Immortal Flames and I fought as hard as we could, but eventually we were just outnumbered and overwhelmed. The name is knocked unconscious, and we're all transported to an unknown location. We wake up to find ourselves, along with the remaining flame soldiers and dozens of other innocents, tied up in this cave crevice, clearly far from our initial location. It was obvious that something bad was about to happen, and we didn't have to wait long to find out what, as all of the prisoners, including even Ungust despite his loyalty to the Amalja, were all going to be tempered into worshippers of Ifrit, Lord of the Inferno, and the Amalja's god. Through prayer and worship, Ifrit was summoned and quickly tempered all in attendance, except for the name. Fearing our willpower, Ifrit decides that slaying us would be the next best course of action. But with the help of some random adventurers just passing by, the name was able to give Ifrit the battle of its life. With the defeat of the Lord of the Inferno, the name collects another crystal, similar to the one that Void-Sent creature had, and then reinforcements arrive, led by Thancred, to come to our rescue. The remaining Amalja are quickly dispatched, and the tempered flames are subdued. Thancred and the rest of the rescue team navigate us out of the area and head back to Camp Drybone, while at the same time, officers of the Garlean Empire watch from above, noting the strength of Ifrit and the name. Thancred regrets sending us on that mission alone, but is impressed by our ability to lay a god low, and after finishing up a few grim tasks, we return to the Waking Sands to give Menphilia the news. Despite the loss of good men, the defeat of Ifrit is a victory worth celebrating, and that should be something to be proud of. And it seems like that feeling is mutual, since soon after, 3 representatives of the Grand Companies of Eorzea barge into the room, looking to recruit the name into their ranks. Well, shit.